Welcome back to this digital seminary course on the Bible. The goal of this course is to help you understand how the Bible works, how it was written, formed, transmitted, translated, till it ended up in your hands. Now, in part 1, we talked about canonization. In part 2, we talked about transmission. Now we're going to talk about translation. Here we go. In Matthew 28, Jesus tells his followers to make disciples of all nations. At Pentecost, worshipers from places like Parthia, Media, Arabia, Libya, Rome, Crete, all that, they gathered together to hear the good news about Jesus in their own language, which means the very beginning of the church was a moment of miraculous translation, communicating the meaning contained in one language into another language. In the early days of the church, missionary work was often synonymous with language work. Now, Greek and Latin were widespread languages throughout the Roman Empire. Latin dominated in the West, Greek in the East. This language divide is also the fault upon which the church would eventually split. The Roman Empire, too, began to break on this fault line with an emperor in the West and an emperor in the East, sometimes more. This is why we talk about Eastern Orthodox churches, for instance, as distinct from Roman or Protestant churches. Now, not all of those Eastern churches spoke Greek, of course. The believers in Syria had what is probably the earliest translation of the New Testament sometime in the 2nd century called the Peshitta. You'll recall that the earliest Christians weren't sure about the authority of certain books like 2 Peter or Jude, so it isn't a surprise that the Peshitta is missing those books, although they were later added in 616 AD. The Bible was being translated into other regional languages as well, like Gothic, Armenian, Georgian, Old Latin, Slavic, Coptic down in Egypt. In the earliest days, translation of these early Christian scriptures was out of missionary necessity. Likely, missionary translated small passages as he was able so he could communicate with the people he was trying to persuade with the gospel. The quality wouldn't be very good, as it wasn't with the earliest Latin translations, known as the Old Latin translations. These early translations would also be piecemeal, as few had the time or the skill to translate all of the Bible, Old and New. So that left the early church with a large number of partial translations, some of good quality, many not so much. But what was needed was a coming together of these various manuscript traditions into one consistent professional translation. Now, this shouldn't be surprising. This is how movements are often formed. There's this big bang where people are scattered everywhere, doing whatever seems best to them. Then, over time, they're pulled together, first into local churches like Corinth or Laodicea, then into larger regions like how Alexandria influenced a whole corner of the Mediterranean, and then, in the end, under the influence of, for instance, a pope in Rome. Adventists, too, were scattered after the disappointment of 1844. Each went their own way, doing their own thing, but then a few of them began to coalesce, and you get the idea. This scattered situation changed in the 4th century. Pope Damasus in 382 asked his secretary, a scholar named Jerome, to translate the Gospels into better Latin. Jerome saw his task as gathering, in his words, the copies of the Scriptures which are now scattered throughout the whole world, and inasmuch as they differ from one another, you would have me decide which of them agree with the Greek original. Jerome was humbled by this. He knew that he would be open to criticism because finding the original text was not a purely scientific process. People would accuse him of imposing his agenda by picking the text that he preferred, but this work had to be done because this wild west of manuscripts and translations made heresy, and I use that term loosely and non-judgmentally, it made heresy easy. With so many different manuscripts out there, it was easy to offer your personal take on the story of Jesus as if that were the original meaning. You could easily find a manuscript that agreed with you. There was no Bible as we know it that could be brought in to correct you. At least collections of the sacred writings were not easily accessible everywhere and to everyone. As Jerome put it, if we are to pin our faith to the Latin text, it is for our opponents to tell us which, for there are almost as many forms of text as there are copies. And so, the very act of forming a canon and a translation of that canon was the very act of forging an orthodoxy in the church. Jerome was qualified for this work. He was probably the only person in the Western Church who was qualified for it. He had lived in Rome and Bethlehem. He knew Hebrew, Latin, Greek. Now, his translation isn't perfect. It's not always even, but it was good. Pope Damasus originally wanted him to smooth over the old Latin manuscripts, but by the end, Jerome was translating the Hebrew Bible from the original, wait for it, Hebrew, rather than the Greek Septuagint, which many Christians considered to be the edition of the Old Testament that God had inspired. You know, we want to stay away from anything Jewish. Jerome ignored them and, in one letter, called those anti-Semitic Christians two-legged donkeys. This translation of the Hebrew was actually a big deal because, as we've discussed, until relatively recently, the earliest Hebrew copies of the Hebrew Bible were from around the year 1000 AD. So, when we read Jerome's translation of the Hebrew Bible, it can give us clues of what the Hebrew text he was translating actually said. We know Jerome's translation today as the Vulgate. Now, I recognize for Protestants, the Vulgate is synonymous with all of the worst impressions of Roman Catholicism. Don't be a translator hater.
Haters gonna hate. I laugh cause you fake. Lawyer mad cause I do something that you can't.
Latin was the lingua franca of the Western Mediterranean. If you're gonna praise Wycliffe and Tyndale for translating the Bible into English, you should praise Jerome for translating it into Latin, okay? For the first time, believers had an entire Bible, old and new, in their own language that read and sounded consistent from Genesis to Revelation. The earliest English translations, such as John Wycliffe's, came from the Vulgate, not the original Hebrew and Greek. And what's more, we owe many of the theological words we use as Protestants to the Vulgate, words like justify and sanctify. But the largest debt that we owe the Vulgate is that it set the precedent for translation in Christian history. Learn the original languages, find the best manuscripts, work professionally and consistently, translate it into the language of the people. That's a very Protestant thing. Now, this leads us to talk about the nature of translation. Anytime you translate something, you are also interpreting it. When Jerome used words like sanctify and justify in his Vulgate, he wasn't simply finding the exact Latin equivalent of those Greek words. Sanctify and justify come from the world of the Roman courtroom and don't capture the originally Hebrew idea of righteousness or holiness. The Eastern Church, less influenced by the Latin Vulgate, never developed this legal sense of being declared righteous, which justification implies. I'm not getting into soteriology here and taking a side. I only want to show you how translation always adds or subtracts shades of meaning. For example, translation of the Greek word doulos. Doulos means slave, but when an American English reader sees slave, well, it takes on meanings for us that Paul never meant when he cheerfully called himself a slave of Christ. Some English translations go with servant instead of slave, giving the text a Downton Abbey feel. Is Paul Jesus' butler? Is he wearing a nice suit as he makes sure Jesus has enough lemonade? Or take a word like Christ. It means anointed one, often a common euphemism for Messiah. So should you translate a text with that word Jesus anointed one, or Jesus Messiah, or Jesus Christ? You have to first study the text to know what the writer meant, and only after you've interpreted it can you find the best word for your translation. This is why the Bible is always being translated. Bible translation is not so much about printed versions of the Bible, okay? The joke among translators is that as soon as the translation is printed, after years of intensive work, it's already out of date. That's because language is always changing. Think of how many words are used now every day that we didn't even have 20 years ago. Words like selfie. I mean, look at the King James Version. If you can get a facsimile of the 1611 edition, most people can't even read it. Like, they literally cannot even read it. They styled letters differently in 1611. They use words we no longer use, like snuff dishes. The Bible constantly needs translation. And we all constantly translate it or paraphrase it. When a pastor gets up in church and says, in other words, what Paul's saying is, she is translating Paul. This is not a translation from Greek or German, but from English to more understandable English. And that pastor is translating when she uses different words to make the meaning clearer. This is why I think it's so important we learn about Bible translations, because we are all translators, so we might as well know what we're doing, huh? Now, let's set aside this translatorhood of all believers idea and just pretend that you got asked to lead a team in producing a new translation of the Bible. After all, we haven't had a new English translation in 5 minutes, so we're overdue for one. So how does this process work? What kind of questions are you going to have to consider? All right, let's do this. The first decision you're going to have to make is, what source text do I use? Jerome began with the Old Latin manuscripts, then the Septuagint, and eventually the Hebrew, because he thought it of greater accuracy than the Septuagint. Most modern Bibles today, as I said in our transmission video, use an eclectic text, a mixture of the various textual families. Not all of them do, but most of them. We'll talk more about that in our next video and the one after that. Now, there's other things you have to consider as well. We're just getting warmed up here. You need to establish some principles of translation, some guidelines. Are you aiming for a word-for-word translation or a more idiomatic translation? How are you handling the names of God? Are you going to put Adonai in there? Do you require the translators to subscribe to certain theological beliefs which may give them a bias in their work? You also have to decide what style of English you're going to use. How readable do you want this to be? For what grade level? And for that, you're going to have to keep in mind the literacy of the population you're translating for. Can most people read? If only the elite can read, you can probably choose a more technical style of language. Do you want children to be able to read this? Well, then obviously that affects your style. Also, what is the purpose of this translation? Are you translating it to be read aloud in churches for worship? You might prefer a more poetic style. How are you going to translate monetary or measurement terms? For instance, a denarius is a day's wage in Jesus' time, but nobody today uses a denarius or even knows what one is. The average American daily wage for an 8-hour workday in 2020 is about $200. So should you just write $200 in the text? Of course, you know that will change every year, so maybe that's not a good idea. Ooh, and what are you going to do about gender? Paul addresses the brethren even when men and women are worshiping together. Does that mean his words were not meant for women? Are you just going to make it brothers and sisters and add that word sisters in there? How will you handle that? Now, look, it might seem like I'm trying to muddy the waters here, but these are all really important decisions that translators need to make, and it's part of the reason why we have so many translations. Hopefully, you now see that it's nonsense to talk about a literal translation. This is pet peeve time, okay? It's literally nonsense. Which way do you have to answer all of those questions I just asked so that you can consider your translation literal? Literally, Genesis 1:1 opens up, "In the beginning created God the heavens," in Hebrew. Is that a literal translation? Okay, well maybe we don't mean translate word for word in the same order, right? A new translation appeared this year in the spring of 2020 called the Literal Standard Version. It's kind of a spiritual successor to Young's literal translation. What does this new Literal Standard Version mean by literal? They use literal synonymously with word for word, except it's not actually word for word because you cannot translate one language to another without adding or subtracting some words. Because the goal of translation, my friends, is to communicate meaning, not just words. So let's say you have to translate this phrase. That TV show jumped the shark back in season 3. Now, jump the shark is an American English idiom that means the show has run out of creative ideas and it's beginning to decline. How do you translate that? Okay, you could translate it literally, word for word, but the reader won't know what jump the shark means. If the goal of translation is to communicate meaning, then you might not use the words jump the shark. Maybe you'll just rewrite it a little bit to something like, that show began to decline back in season 3. So which way is the literal translation of that sentence? I don't think you can even answer that. You also need to keep the audience in mind when translating, okay? Jerome recognized the need to account for the reader as well. He reassured the readers of his gospel translation that he used his pen with some restraint in order that the text might sound as familiar as possible to its hearers. Look at all the grief the modern English translations have stirred up in the churches, leaving out these verses that were found in the great King James Version and all of that. Look, people are emotionally connected to the text and the way it reads. I grew up memorizing the King James Version's way of rendering John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. The reality is that the NET is probably more accurate in its translation when it writes, for this is the way God loved the world, he gave his one and only Son. The NET recognizes what I believe is John's intended meaning, that the sending of Jesus was the way God showed his love for the world. But that translation, even though I think it's more accurate, will probably never catch on. Because people have it in their heads that this text should sound a certain way, and that's fine. It's just something translators have to account for. Translation is not a pure science. There's some politics in it as well. There's an art in it. It doesn't matter how good your translation is if people reject it, which is kind of what happened to the Vulgate for the next few hundred years. People constantly wrote the old Latin wording that they liked better than Jerome's text, and they wrote it in the margins of his text, of the Vulgate. 200 years after Jerome completed it, one monk had to gather copies of the Vulgate to figure out what the original text of the Vulgate even was. It had been so marked up. The goal of this video, guys, It's been to give you a survey of the earliest translations, paying attention especially to the Latin Vulgate, and then to introduce some challenges that translators face. Sometimes translators are biased, they insert their own views. We've seen how that's happened throughout history. But I hope you have come to appreciate the unique challenges translators face and have come to appreciate this process of translation and the importance of this process of translation a little bit more than when you started this video. In the next video, we're going to talk about the early English translations, so I hope to see you then.